So you've heard of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, right? Home to some of the best skiing in North America, playground of billionaires, site of the annual Federal Reserve Economics Conference that moves markets around the world. But here's the question nobody asks. Why the hell is it called a hole? I mean, seriously, when you think about holes, you think about something negative. Potholes, sinkholes, that hole in your favorite jeans. But Jackson Hole? It's one of the most spectacular valleys on the planet, surrounded by majestic Teton Mountains. So what gives? Today we're diving into the wild, beaver-obsessed, slightly drunk history of how mountain men named one of America's most beautiful places after a hole. Let's rewind to the early 1800s. Picture this: rough, independent trappers roaming the Rocky Mountains, surviving on their wits, their rifle skills, and an alarming amount of beaver. These weren't your average outdoorsmen. These guys would set their own broken bones, eat rotten meat when necessary, and spend months alone in grizzly country. They called themselves mountain men, and they had their own language. And in that language, a hole wasn't an insult. It was actually a compliment. To these trappers, a hole was a large, flat valley completely surrounded by mountains. Think of it like nature's bowl. You'd be traveling through steep, rugged terrain, descending from high elevations, and suddenly drop down into this protected basin. That sensation of entering something enclosed, that's where the term came from. You literally felt like you were going into a hole in the mountains. But here's the key: not just any valley earned the hole designation. They had to be special. We're talking about low-lying valleys with streams, rivers, abundant wildlife, and most importantly, beaver. Lots and lots of beaver. Now you might be wondering why grown men were obsessed over rodents. Well, in the early 1800s, beaver pelts were liquid gold. In Europe and on the East Coast, beaver fur hats were the height of fashion. We're talking about prices of $4 to $6 per pound, and a resourceful mountain man could trap 400 to 500 pounds per year. So do the math. That's potentially over $2,000 a year at a time when an ambitious man might otherwise earn $300 to $500 a year. Not bad for hanging out in pristine wilderness, right? So these holes, these mountain valleys with beaver-rich streams, good camping spots, and plenty of game for food were exactly where mountain men wanted to be. They were prime real estate in the fur trade economy. Now let's talk about the Jackson part of Jackson Hole. The valley was named after David Edward Jackson. His friends called him Davy, who trapped beaver in the area in the late 1820s. Jackson was a part of the legendary fur trading firm of Smith, Jackson, and Sublette, alongside other famous mountain men like Jebediah Smith and William Sublette. Jackson, who was of Irish and Scottish descent, became one of the first European Americans to spend an entire winter in the valley. And apparently he loved it so much that his fellow trappers started calling it Jackson's Hole. Over time, the possessive got dropped and it became simply Jackson Hole. Here's what I love about this. The guy's name is immortalized in one of the most exclusive zip codes in America, but we don't even know that much about his personal life. He shows up in the historical record, traps some beaver, survives a brutal Wyoming winter, and boom, permanent naming rights to a valley that would one day host Kanye West's album recording sessions. Not bad for a guy who spent his days up to his knees in freezing streams setting up beaver traps. And Jackson Hole wasn't the only hole in the region. Over in Idaho, just on the other side of the Teton Range, there was Pierre's Hole, named after Le Grand Pierre Tevanitagan, an Iroquois trapper working for the Hudson's Bay Company who was killed in a battle with Blackfeet in 1827. Pierre's Hole hosted one of the most famous mountain man gatherings, the Rendezvous of 1832. We're talking hundreds of trappers, Native Americans, fur company representatives, all converging to trade furs, resupply, and frankly, get absolutely hammered. Historical records mention 450 gallons of whiskey at this gathering. For context, that's enough booze to fill up about 2,400 modern wine bottles. The party got so wild it ended with a massive battle between trappers and a group of Gros Ventre warriors. 5 trappers and 7 of their Native American allies died. It was literally the party that ended in a war. The terminology spreads. The mountain men used this hole terminology all over the Rockies. There were other holes scattered throughout Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. Basically anywhere you had these protected valleys that were perfect for trapping. And here's what's fascinating. This wasn't formal cartography. There were no government surveyors carefully designating these areas. This was working class slang that just happened to stick. These rough, independent trappers just started calling these places holes, and the names became permanent. It's kind of beautiful when you think about it. While fancy European cartographers were giving flowery names to geographical features, American mountain men were like, yeah, it's a hole, and somehow that just won. Fast forward to today, and Jackson Hole is transformed from a beaver's trapper's paradise to one of the most expensive real estate markets in America. Celebrities like Harrison Ford, Sandra Bullock, and yes, Kanye West have called it home. The Valley hosts the annual Jackson Hole Economic Symposium, where the world's most powerful central bankers gather to discuss monetary policy. There's probably no other place they could do it. The irony is delicious. The same valley that mountain men valued for its abundance of fur-bearing rodents is now valued for its tax advantages. Wyoming has no state income tax, and it has world-class skiing. The town of Jackson wasn't even incorporated until 1914, and the valley wasn't settled year-round until the 1870s. Before that, Native American tribes, including the Shoshone, Crow, and Bannock, used it for seasonal hunting. The winters were simply too brutal for permanent settlement. Even the airport has an interesting claim to fame. Jackson Hole Airport is the only commercial airport in the United States located entirely within a national park, Grand Teton National Park. Try getting that approved by the FAA today. What I find most compelling about this story is how the language of working people, these independent, slightly crazy trappers who lived by their wits, became the permanent name for a place. The mountain men era was relatively brief. By 1840, the fur trade had collapsed. Beaver populations were depleted from overtrapping and fashion had moved on. Silk hats replaced beaver. The price per pound of beaver pelts dropped from $6 to just $1 or $2. Most trappers had moved on to other work. But their naming conventions stuck. Jackson Hole, Pierce Hole, and others remain to this day. These men, like Davy Jackson, Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, John Coulter, were the original guides and scouts of the American West. They mapped territories, learned to survive in impossible conditions, and created the trails that would later become wagon roads for westward expansion. And they did it all while apparently being completely fine with calling beautiful mountain valleys holes. So the next time someone mentions Jackson Hole, whether they're talking about skiing, celebrity real estate, or Federal Reserve policy, you'll know the truth. It's not a marketing name. It's not a geological term. It's a 19th century trapper slang for a really good place to catch beaver. It's a reminder that sometimes the most permanent names come from the most informal sources, from mountain men who probably smelled like campfire smoke and beaver musk, who drank too much whiskey at summer rendezvous, and who had zero idea that the valleys they named would one day be the playgrounds for the ultra-wealthy. The hole is a badge of honor. It's the mountain men's way of saying, this place is worth staying in. And honestly, they weren't wrong.